By the mid-16th century, the Scandinavian peninsula was a tinderbox of ambition, rivalry, and territorial tension, a region where the crowns of Sweden and Denmark and Norway jostled not only for influence over trade and borders, but for the very soul of the Baltic Sea, whose shores and waterways offered wealth, strategic dominance, and the lifeblood of commerce in Northern Europe. Into this crucible erupted the conflict known as the Northern 7 Years' War, a prolonged struggle between 1563 and 1570 that would embroil kings, nobles, mercenaries, and sailors alike. A war whose flames reflected both the strategic ambitions of monarchs and the fragile alliances that governed the destinies of nations. This war was not merely a military confrontation. It was a test of administrative skill, diplomatic subtlety, economic endurance, and personal courage, a saga in which fleets clashed in the icy waters of the Baltic, fortresses were besieged and stormed, and the ambitions of rulers like Eric XIV of Sweden and Frederick II of Denmark Norway collided with devastating consequences for soldiers, civilians, and the very fabric of Nordic politics. It was a war that would define an era, shaping borders, allegiances, and the memory of a generation. The Northern 7 Years' War cannot be understood without examining the tangled web of political, dynastic, and economic tension that preceded it. Sweden, having emerged from the Colonial Union as a sovereign kingdom, sought to assert dominance over trade in the Baltic Sea, particularly in rivalry with Denmark-Norway, which claimed both historical preeminence and strategic ports essential to controlling commerce. The Sound toll, the Danish levy on ships passing through the recent, became a flashpoint. Swedish merchants and monarchs alike resented this restriction, which threatened Sweden's economic ambitions and national pride. Eric XIV of Sweden, newly ascended to the throne in 1560, was ambitious and restless, determined to expand Sweden's influence and consolidate power against both internal and external rivals. Meanwhile, Frederick II of Denmark-Norway, a monarch both shrewd and tenacious, saw Sweden's ambitions as a direct threat to his kingdom's security and trade dominance, particularly along the contested coasts of Skåne, Blekinge, and Halland. Tensions escalated as both crowns began fortifying positions, forging alliances, and positioning fleets, until diplomacy could no longer restrain the inevitability of war. The spark ignited in 1563 when Sweden, aiming to challenge Danish dominance, initiated military actions along the southern coasts and sought to assert control over strategic fortresses. Denmark, in turn, declared war, mobilizing both land forces and a powerful navy to confront the Swedish threat. What followed was a 7-year struggle characterized by brutal sieges, naval engagements, raids along the Baltic littoral, and the repeated mobilization of armies whose logistics taxed the very resources of both kingdoms. Early in the war, Sweden attempted to assert dominance over Skåne and the provinces along the Baltic, but Danish fortresses, supported by the Danish-Norwegian Navy, repelled these advances. Battles were fought at Gland, Bornholm, and along the Elv, with victories and defeats trading hands, demonstrating the precarious balance of power and the uncertainty of medieval and early modern warfare. The war rapidly became a conflict of attrition, testing the administrative competence, supply chains, and resolve of both monarchs. One of the defining features of the Northern 7 Years' War was its naval dimension, as control of the Baltic Sea was essential for commerce, supply lines, and strategic maneuvering. The Swedish fleet, under the direction of admirals such as Claus Horn, clashed repeatedly with the Danish-Norwegian Navy in decisive battles, including the famous engagements near Gland in 1564, where ship-to-ship combat, boarding actions, and artillery exchanges revealed the growing sophistication of naval warfare. Both sides understood that maritime supremacy would dictate the terms of the war on land, influencing the movement of troops, the resupply of fortresses, and the projection of political power across the Baltic littoral. The conflict demonstrated innovations in ship design, gunnery, and tactics, with fleets enduring storms, logistical nightmares, and the ever-present threat of disease and mutiny, highlighting the immense complexity of early modern warfare. While the Baltic Sea was the lifeblood of strategic maneuvering, the war's land campaigns were equally brutal and consequential. Swedish forces sought to press into Danish-held territories, besieging fortresses, raiding towns, and attempting to coerce Denmark-Norway into concessions. Conversely, Danish armies launched retaliatory incursions into Swedish provinces, ravaging countryside, capturing towns, and attempting to break Swedish morale. Sieges at key locations such as Varberg, Halmstad, and Ulvsborg became protracted affairs, with both sides employing artillery bombardments, mining operations, and negotiations under threat of assault. Civilians bore the brunt of these campaigns, as towns were pillaged, supply shortages caused famine, and outbreaks of disease swept through encamped soldiers and besieged populations alike. The Northern 7 Years' War was thus as much a contest of endurance as of arms, testing the resilience of both nations. Despite the ferocity of combat, diplomacy remained a critical dimension of the conflict. Both Sweden and Denmark-Norway sought allies, sought to broker truces, and attempted to leverage external powers, including the Hanseatic League, Lübeck, and various German principalities, to support their strategic objectives. Treaties were proposed, negotiations faltered, and intermittent truces were broken as mistrust and ambition dictated the rhythm of the war. Over time, it became clear that neither side could secure a decisive victory. Sweden's incursions were contained by fortifications and Danish naval dominance, while Denmark's attempts to subdue Sweden were thwarted by resilient Swedish leadership and the harsh northern terrain. The war settled into a grinding stalemate, in which the cost of continuation, financial, human, and political, threatened both monarchies. At the heart of the conflict were the personalities of the two kings, whose decisions shaped the war's conduct. Eric XIV, brilliant but increasingly erratic, oscillated between audacious offensives and paranoid suspicion of both allies and nobles, a psychological volatility that complicated Swedish strategy. Frederick II, in contrast, displayed disciplined pragmatism, coordinating fleets and armies with careful attention to logistics and morale, while using diplomacy to counterbalance Sweden's aggression. The interplay between these monarchs reflected the nature of 16th century warfare, personal ambition, dynastic rivalry, and the exercise of royal authority could determine the fate of entire provinces and thousands of soldiers, turning political calculation into human drama on a grand scale. The Northern 7 Years' War exacted a devastating toll on soldiers and civilians alike. Contemporary accounts describe scorched villages, pillaged towns, and displaced populations, with famine and disease claiming lives far beyond the battlefield. Nobles and commoners alike experienced the instability of continuous warfare, while economies strained under taxation to support armies and fleets. The war also disrupted trade across the Baltic, affecting merchants, ports, and the intricate networks that linked Northern Europe in commerce and cultural exchange. Despite this suffering, the conflict forged a sense of shared identity within Sweden, as resistance against Denmark always strengthened national cohesion and underscored the importance of centralized authority in sustaining prolonged conflict. After 7 long years of attrition, exhaustion, and indecisive campaigns, the Northern 7 Years' War concluded with the Treaty of Stettin in 1570. The treaty largely restored pre-war borders, reflecting the inconclusive nature of the conflict, yet it marked a formal recognition of each kingdom's sovereignty and the limitations of territorial ambition in the Baltic region. While no decisive military victory emerged, the war reshaped political dynamics. Sweden's assertion of naval and military capability, the exposure of Danish vulnerabilities, and the lessons learned in administration, logistics, and diplomacy influenced subsequent conflicts in the Baltic for decades to come. The war had demonstrated the destructive potential of prolonged regional rivalry, as well as the precarious balance between ambition, strategy, and human endurance. The Northern 7 Years' War endures in history not merely as a military contest, but as a story of ambition, resilience, and the human cost of protracted conflict. A saga in which kings and generals, sailors and soldiers, nobles and peasants all played roles in a drama that engulfed the lands and seas of Scandinavia. It was a war that tested the courage of leaders, the endurance of nations, and the capacity of societies to survive under continuous strain. In remembering this conflict, we see the complexities of early modern warfare, the interweaving of naval strategy and land campaigns, the crucial role of diplomacy and alliances, the personal ambitions of monarchs, and the suffering of ordinary people caught in the tides of history. The Northern 7 Years' War was more than a battle for territory. It was a crucible that forged national identities, revealed the limits of power, and illuminated the perilous intersection of ambition, strategy, and human fragility in the harsh northern lands of Europe.